And I wanted, so there's so much to unpack here. So I want to drill down into this framework that you've come up with. So what we're talking about really is a high stakes or a high risk scenario that has lots of different flow triggers, right? So the challenge skill balance is there. We've got someone that's deeply concentrated on the task at hand. In the paper, you're talking about the motorcycle scenario. So based on your exploration of the research, your review of all of the science to date, what's your take on the different factors that might push someone in the direction that's in that situation, in the direction of either flow or to trauma? What's happening there? What's going on?
Let me start with that one. Stephen, you mind?
No, I know you always like this one, so you.
I love it. Yeah. So this is a great question. So I'll start off with a quote from Stephen. He has this great quote in The Art of Impossible: "Flow starts when you say yes to the fight." And so that's very, very interesting, because there's always a challenge. You're presented with a perceived challenge, and you're bringing a certain skill set to that task. So there's always this moment of approach or avoidance. And so what we think is happening here is that getting into a flow state versus a trauma, getting into a flow state is associated with a proactive willingness to approach the situation, to approach the challenge, to face it, versus trauma, which is maybe associated with a reactive sort of willingness to avoid the situation. So you can couch this in terms of approach avoidance or fight or flight, right? But flow is always associated with a challenge, and a challenge presents difficulties to the brain. And so whether you're in a high stakes scenario or a low stakes scenario. And so that's what kind of we're exploring, is this point of departure that the brain takes with approach versus with avoidance.
And Tori, it's worth, I mean, this isn't a new idea. And it's like, if you go back, Hans Seel's, like, I think it's 1935 paper on eustress and de-stress, which was based on the Erbs-Dobson curve that becomes, once Csikszentmihalyi shows up, the challenge skills balance, right? He had this notion of positive versus negative stress going all the way back in these two systems. And what's interesting about it, so some of this work, it really started, like, I was thinking about all this stuff. I had dinner with Andrew Huberman when we were up in Seattle at one of our early events, and Andrew's lab at Stanford had literally separated out the fight response. And they figured out that the fight response is localized in the thalamus, whereas freeze and flee were in the amygdala. And so the mechanism I was looking for, and we're not 100% certain if what Michael said is 100% true all the time. You're always going to say yes to the fight. You're always going to approach it. We believe that usually that actually means quite literally triggering the fight response. So with that momentary surge, and while it's not in the paper, you get testosterone. Among other focusing and energizing chemicals, you get a little bit of testosterone with that fight response. And the freeze response, the flee response, it's that I don't have control and I'm trying to run away. And really want to emphasize, it's not just saying yes to the fight and approaching, it's a sense of, I got this, versus, oh my God, I'm going to get my ass kicked.
Right. Now,
you can go into a situation and think you're going to get your ass kicked and still triumph and end up in flow on the back end of it, but it seems much more unlikely.
Yeah. And that's also part of the overall project here, is linking, like you said, sense of, I got this. That's the phenomenological, subjective, like felt experience, and linking that with what's going on in the neurobiology. So you have this neurophenomenological approach. So that's what we're really trying to do. And one of the goals in the paper is to try, for the first time in the literature, really trying to connect the neurobiology, the empirical data, with the phenomenology, the self-reporting that Csikszentmihalyi studied, and seeing how those mutually constrain one another, right? So how the data informs what people report, but then also using those self-reports, that sense of control, to inform how we interpret the data from neuroimaging studies, for example.
And which is huge. This is a huge advancement in flow science and our understanding of flow. And if I'm hearing you correctly, it feels like one of these key differentiators between, is someone going to go down the path to trauma versus the path to flow, is this ability to act in that moment. So,
Yes.
which seems like it has huge implications for, building anti-fragility, resilience, and potentially even treating PTSD.
Yeah. Versus the
Yeah, and
inability to
in
act
fact,
in trauma.
the inability to act, right? Like going all the way back to Van der Kolk's really famous 1989 paper, inability to act is always associated with trauma. There's a, it's the difference. I say the end result of this inability to act is Marty Seligman's famous work on learned helplessness, right? Like where the inability to act is so bad that you just give up. Our argument is essentially that flow is the flip side. It's this learned powerfulness, right? It's based on, deciding to act. And in a sense, you can say that flow starts when we detect novel stimuli and decide to act on it. And it's interesting also, if you look at the systems level neuroscience view that we end up with at the end, Richard Husky's work, we're either seeing metastability or synchrony. It's a little unclear between the executive control network, which allows us to stay focused on task and keep out all distraction, and the goal-directed network, right? And the goal-directed network, this is acting and the ability to act and approaching, like that's what's kicking that into gear. Right. The novel, in a sense, you can see the two things that end up being in flow sort of getting involved early on, right? Because you've got this salience thing that you're focusing on. So you've got the frontal parietal control network getting active right then and there. And you've got the goal-directed system kicking in. A bunch of stuff happens along the way. But in the end, Richard's argument is that these two systems, there's synchronous behavior. So they're doing roughly the same thing at the same time. The other option is Scott Kelso's idea around metastability, which is sort of the same things happening. It's just sort of a slightly different way. It's not quite as synchronous. And I think we need better imaging data to actually figure out which one that's going to be. It's hard to get like these neural dynamics are fast, as Michael said. So like trying fMRI, it's like a 2-second picture. And we were talking about stuff that takes place in like 200ths of a second.
Correct.
It's hard to figure that out.
And piggyback on that, like I wanted to go back to this idea of cognitive control. And first of all, post-traumatic growth. So learned powerfulness. This is one of the reasons why then there's research on this. There needs to be more research on this. We're actually working on this now. That flow can we know flow helps with burnout. We know flow helps with depression. Flow increases psychological well-being and subjective well-being and so on and so forth. But flow may also act as a very interesting therapeutic approach to PTSD. And this exactly may be why.